Welcome to a deep dive all about the idea of virtue. You might be, getting ready for a philosophy class or brushing up on ethics or, maybe just curious about, the history of goodness and all that.
Yeah.
Well, we've got some really interesting sources to look at today with you guys.
Yeah.
Encyclopedia entries, historical accounts, different cultures and philosophies.
Buckle up.
Yeah, buckle up. It's going to be a wild ride.
It's so fascinating how virtue is often presented as this sort of simple concept. But as we're going to see today, it's anything but simple, really.
Yeah, right. It's a journey through time and all across the globe, and with some surprising twists and turns along the way. So, okay, first things first. How do we even define virtue?
Well, our trusty Wikipedia article says it's a trait or quality deemed to be morally good and thus valued as an end purpose of life.
Okay.
But even that seemingly straightforward definition, I think, is more complex than it appears.
Oh, really? I'm already intrigued. What makes you say that?
Well, just consider the word virtue itself. It comes from the Latin word vir, meaning man.
Wait, hold on. So originally virtue was all about being manly. That's a pretty narrow view.
Exactly. And that right there, I think, tells us something important about virtue. Ideas about virtue are tied to cultural values, and we know those can change so much over time. What's considered good in one culture might be seen as completely different in another, or even in the same culture centuries later.
Right. Makes me think about how, those ancient Roman emperors would hold gladiator contests, as entertainment. Not exactly what we would call virtuous today.
Precisely. Our modern sensibilities are quite different. But let's rewind even further back in time, all the way back to ancient Egypt.
Oh, yes. The land of pharaohs and pyramids. Didn't they have some interesting ideas about virtue?
They did indeed. In ancient Egypt, the concept of Ma'at played a central role. Ma'at wasn't just an abstract concept, though. She was a goddess who personified truth balance, justice, and cosmic order.
So it wasn't just about being a good person. It was about maintaining harmony in the entire universe. That's a pretty big responsibility.
Absolutely. Your actions weren't just seen as having personal consequences. They had ripple effects on the cosmos as a whole. And that emphasis on cosmic order that wasn't unique to the Egyptians, we see similar ideas in many other cultures as well.
Which brings us to the ancient Greeks. They were big on virtue, if I remember correctly, from my Philosophy 101 class.
You remember correctly, the ancient Greeks were obsessed with virtue. And for them, it wasn't just theoretical. It was about living a good life both individually and as a society. In fact, they had a very specific set of virtues they considered absolutely essential, the four cardinal virtues.
Okay, refresh my memory. What were those again?
Prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance.
Prudence. So like thinking before you act, being wise and making good decisions.
Precisely. Prudence is about using reason and good judgment to guide all of your actions. It's the opposite of being impulsive or reckless.
Okay.
Then you have justice, which is all about fairness and giving everyone their due.
Kind of like that saying, treat others how you want to be treated, right?
Exactly. It's about recognizing the inherent worth and dignity of every individual and acting accordingly.
Gotcha.
Then we have fortitude,
Okay.
which we might think of as courage or resilience.
Right.
It's about facing challenges head on, even when things get tough.
Don't give up, don't back down sort of thing.
Yes. Fortitude is about having that inner strength to persevere in the face of adversity. And lastly, we have temperance, which is all about moderation and self-control. It's about finding balance in your life and not overindulging in anything.
Okay, so not too much partying.
Got it.
But seriously, I can see how these four virtues would have been seen as essential for a well-functioning society.
Absolutely. The Greeks believed that cultivating these virtues was crucial not only for individual happiness, but also for the health and stability of the state. A society full of people who are prudent, just courageous and temperate, that sounds like a pretty good place to live.
I'd sign up for that.
There.
But weren't the Romans big on virtue too? Did they have their own list?
They did indeed. And while there was some overlap with the Greek virtues, the Romans added their own unique flavor to the mix. They highly valued civic duty, for example, which is about actively participating in public life and contributing to the common good.
So it's not just about being a good person in your private life, it's about being a responsible citizen and taking care of your community.
Exactly. And that's reflected in some of their specific virtues, such as pietas, which encompasses devotion to family, gods, and country, gravitas, having a sense of seriousness and responsibility, and dignitas, maintaining your dignity and self-worth.
Those are interesting. They really capture that sense of duty and honor that we often associate with the Romans.
They do indeed. And these virtues weren't just abstract ideals, they were woven into the fabric of Roman society. For example, gravitas was considered essential for political leaders.
So you wouldn't want a goofy, unserious person running the Roman Empire.
Precisely. They needed someone who commanded respect and took their responsibilities seriously.
Now, before we go too far down the Roman road, let's take a quick detour to another part of the world, ancient India.
That's a great idea. Ancient India offers a rich tapestry of philosophical and spiritual traditions, many of which have fascinating perspectives on virtue.
From what I've read, the concept of was pretty central to their understanding of ethics. What exactly does that mean?
Amin is a Tamil word that encompasses a whole way of harmonious living. It's about living in alignment with nature, with the community, and with yourself. It's about finding balance and cultivating virtues like nonviolence, truthfulness, and compassion.
Sounds like a recipe for a peaceful and fulfilling life.
It does indeed. And the Tamil poet Veluvar, who wrote extensively about believed that cultivating these virtues was essential for achieving true happiness.
I'm sensing a theme here, whether it's the Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, or ancient Indians. There seems to be this common thread. Virtue is about more than just personal gain. It's about living in harmony with something bigger than yourself, whether it's the cosmos, society, or nature.
That's a brilliant observation. And as we continue our journey through the history of virtue, I think you'll find that this theme keeps popping up in different forms.
I can't wait to see what other fascinating perspectives we uncover. So we've journeyed from the pyramids of Egypt to the philosophical schools of Greece and Rome, and even across to ancient India, talk about a whirlwind tour. But we're not done yet, are we?
Not even close. Our exploration of virtue wouldn't be complete without delving into the ideas of some pretty influential figures from medieval and early modern Europe, and perhaps a surprising stop along the way, the world of chivalry.
Chivalry, you mean knights in shining armor and damsels in distress? That sounds a bit romanticized, doesn't it?
It does, but there's more to it than meets the eye. Chivalry wasn't just about, jousting and courtly love. It was an entire code of conduct that emphasized certain virtues deemed absolutely essential for a knight.
Okay, I'm curious, what kind of virtues are we talking about here? Bravery, obviously, but what else?
Bravery, for sure, that was paramount, but it wasn't just about physical courage on the battlefield. It was also about moral courage, standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Loyalty was another key, virtue loyalty to one's king, one's comrades, and one's word.
So a knight's word was his bond. That sounds pretty serious.
Honesty and integrity were highly valued in the chivalric code, and then there were virtues like courtesy, generosity, and humility, qualities that might seem a bit unexpected for warriors, right?
Yeah, it does seem like kind of a contradiction. You'd think a knight would need to be assertive and maybe even a little arrogant to succeed in battle.
That's an astute observation, and it highlights the tension that sometimes exists between different virtues. But the ideal knight was supposed to be both fierce and compassionate, both strong and humble.
I guess that just reflects the complexities of human nature, right? We're not one-dimensional beings. We can hold seemingly contradictory qualities within ourselves.
Precisely. And that brings us to another interesting point. The influence of religion on the concept of virtue in medieval Europe. Christianity played a major role in shaping the chivalric code.
So it wasn't just about earthly honor and glory. It was also about serving a higher purpose.
Exactly. The ideal knight was supposed to be a warrior for God, defending the faith and protecting the innocent. This idea of virtue being tied to religious belief is something we see in so many different cultures and time periods.
Speaking of different cultures and religions, didn't we have some sources on how virtue is viewed in world religions?
We do, and it's a vast and fascinating topic. Almost every major religion has its own unique take on what it means to be virtuous, often tied to their specific beliefs and practices.
For example, what about Christianity? What are some of the key virtues emphasized there?
Well, we can't talk about Christian virtue without mentioning the theological virtues, faith, hope, and love. These are considered foundational to the Christian life, with love being the greatest of them all.
Love, isn't that a bit, sentimental for a religion that's often seen as, focused on rules and dogma?
That's a common misconception. Love in the Christian context goes far beyond just romantic love or even familial love. It's about selfless, unconditional love for all of humanity, even our enemies.
Wow. That's a pretty radical idea when you think about it.
It is, and it's a concept that's echoed in other religions as well. For instance, in both Judaism and Christianity, the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, is central to their ethical teachings.
Yeah, that's one of those sayings that seems so simple on the surface, but is actually incredibly profound when you really reflect on it.
Absolutely. And it speaks to the importance of empathy and compassion in many religious traditions, in Islam, for example. The concept of Ghihsan encompasses striving for excellence in both your inner and outer life, including treating others with kindness and mercy. And in Buddhism, compassion is one of the four immeasurables, along with loving kindness, sympathetic joy, and equanimity.
So it's not just about personal piety or following rituals. It's about how you interact with the world and treat other people.
Precisely. And while specific virtues may vary across different religions, there often seems to be this common thread, a focus on cultivating qualities that promote harmony, compassion, and ultimately a more just and loving world.
Makes you wonder, are these virtues innate? Or are they something we learn and develop over time? Maybe that's a question for the psychologists.
Perhaps, but before we jump ahead too far, let's spend a little more time with the philosopher.
Oh, yes, we can't forget about those deep thinkers.
The early modern period in Europe saw a huge flourishing of philosophical thought, and many of those thinkers had some fascinating things to say about virtue.
Let's start with someone who's synonymous with philosophical thinking, René Descartes. I think, therefore, I am pretty hard to top that.
Indeed, but Descartes' contributions to philosophy go way beyond just that famous quote. He was a staunch rationalist, believing that reason was the key to understanding the world and living a virtuous life.
So for Descartes, virtue wasn't about blind faith or just following tradition. It was about using your intellect to figure out what's right.
Exactly. Descartes believed that by using reason correctly, we could achieve a kind of moral clarity and make choices that lead to genuine happiness and fulfillment.
That makes me think about all those times when I've made, impulsive decisions based on emotion and later regretted them. Maybe a little more Cartesian reasoning would have served me well.
Perhaps, of course, Descartes' emphasis on reason isn't without its critics. Some argue that it downplays the role of emotions and intuition in ethical decision-making.
That's a good point. Sometimes our gut feelings can guide us in the right direction too, right?
Absolutely. And speaking of different approaches to virtue, let's move on to another philosophical heavyweight, Immanuel Kant.
Ah, Kant. He was a bit of a stickler for rules, wasn't he?
That's one way to put it. Kant's ethical system is known for its emphasis on duty and moral principles. He believed that true virtue isn't about following your feelings or pursuing your own happiness, but about acting in accordance with universal moral laws.
So even if you don't feel like doing the right thing, you should do it anyway, because it's your duty. That sounds pretty demanding.
It is, Kant argued, that our actions should be motivated by a sense of obligation to the moral law, not by our personal desires or inclinations. He believed that only actions motivated by duty have true moral worth.
But doesn't that kind of take away the joy of doing good deeds? If it's all about duty, it seems a bit cold and impersonal.
That's a common critique of Kant's ethics. But his defenders would argue that acting out of duty doesn't preclude you from experiencing positive emotions like satisfaction or fulfillment. It's more about the underlying motivation for your actions.
So it's not that you can't feel good about doing the right thing. It's that your primary reason for doing it should be because it's the right thing to do, not because you expect some reward or recognition.
Precisely. And for Kant, the key to figuring out what's right is to use reason to determine what he called the categorical imperative, a universal moral principle that applies to everyone in every situation.
Okay, I'm going to need a little help here.
Mm-hmm.
What exactly does that mean? How do you figure out this categorical imperative thing?
Well, one way to formulate it is act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law.
So basically, before you act, you should ask yourself, would I want everyone to act this way in this situation? If the answer is yes, then it's probably a morally sound action.
Exactly. It's about thinking beyond your own individual perspective and considering the wider implications of your actions.
It's a pretty challenging way to approach ethics.
It is, but Kant's ideas have been incredibly influential, shaping the way we think about morality and the importance of universal principles.
I can see how his emphasis on duty and moral principles could be especially relevant in fields like law or politics, where you need to make decisions that affect a lot of people.
Absolutely, and his ideas continue to be debated and discussed by philosophers today.
Okay, so we've covered Descartes, the champion of reason, and Kant, the master of duty. Now I'm ready for someone who shakes things up a bit. Someone a little more rebellious, perhaps, and a Friedrich Nietzsche.
Ah, Nietzsche. He's definitely a philosopher who provokes some strong reactions. Some find him brilliant, others find him dangerous. But one thing's for sure, he forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the world we live in.
I remember reading about his concept of master morality versus slave morality. That definitely sounds like a challenge to conventional thinking.
It is Nietzsche argued that traditional morality, with its emphasis on humility, self-sacrifice, and compassion for the weak, was actually a tool of oppression used by the powerful to keep the masses in line.
Whoa, so he's saying that being nice and humble is actually a way of keeping people down. That's a pretty radical idea.
It is, and Nietzsche proposed an alternative, what he called master morality, which values strength, creativity, ambition, and the will to power.
So instead of trying to be good in the traditional sense, he's saying we should embrace our individuality and strive for greatness, even if it means going against the grain.
Exactly. He believed that the true measure of a person is not their adherence to conventional morality, but their ability to create their own values and live life on their own terms.
That's a pretty empowering message, but also a bit scary, right? If everyone just does whatever they want, wouldn't that lead to chaos?
That's a valid concern, and Nietzsche's ideas have certainly been misinterpreted and misused by some to justify, selfish or even harmful behavior.
So how do we reconcile his call for individual self-assertion with the need for a stable and just society?
That's a question that continues to be debated by philosophers and social critics today. But one way to interpret Nietzsche is not as advocating for anarchy, but as challenging us to question our assumptions about what's good and bad, and to think critically about how power dynamics shape our moral beliefs.
That's a thought-provoking perspective.
Yeah.
He's definitely making us re-examine everything we thought we knew about virtue.
He does indeed, and that's the power of philosophy. It pushes us to think beyond our comfort zones and consider new ways of seeing the world.
Okay, after Nietzsche's intensity, I think I need a little dose of down-to-earth practicality. Didn't we have something about Benjamin Franklin in our stack of sources?
Yeah.
He seems like a good antidote to philosophical angst.
You read my mind. Ben Franklin, a man of many talents, also had a keen interest in virtue. But his approach was far more pragmatic than that of the philosophers we've discussed so far.
I can already picture him with his witty sayings and practical advice. What was his take on virtue?
Well, Franklin believed that virtue was essential for both personal success and a thriving society. But instead of getting bogged down in abstract philosophical debates, he took a much more hands-on approach.
I'm guessing he didn't come up with a categorical imperative.
He did not. Instead, he created a list of 13 virtues that he believed were essential for living a good and productive life.
13 virtues. That seems like a lot to keep track of. What were some of them?
Well, there were some familiar ones like temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility.
Those sound very well. Very Franklin-esque practical, focused on self-discipline and good habits.
Yeah. Exactly. And what's fascinating is that Franklin didn't just create this list and call it a day. He actually used it as a framework for his own self-improvement. He kept a journal where he tracked his progress in each virtue, striving to make small improvements each day.
So he was kind of like the original self-help guru.
In a way, yes. And his approach to virtue resonates with a lot of people today. It's about setting achievable goals, developing good habits, and constantly striving to become a better version of yourself.
It's inspiring to think that someone as accomplished as Ben Franklin was still dictated to personal growth and self-improvement. It makes virtue feel more attainable, less like some lofty ideal that's out of reach for us ordinary people.
That's a great point, and it brings us to an interesting question. If virtue is something that can be cultivated, what role does our psychology play?
That's where I think things get really fascinating. We've explored virtue through the lens of philosophy, religion, and history. Now, let's see what modern psychology has to say about it.
Excellent idea. In recent decades, there's been this huge surge of interest in what's called positive psychology, which focuses on human strengths and what makes a flourishing life.
Right. It's about studying what makes people thrive, not just what makes them suffer. I've heard about that.
Exactly. And positive psychology has taken a keen interest in virtue, seeing it as a key ingredient for well-being and happiness.
I bet they've done some really interesting research on this. What have they found?
Well, two prominent researchers in this field, Christopher Peterson and Martin Seligman, conducted this massive study to identify what they called character strengths and virtues.
Character strengths. So it's not just about avoiding vices, it's about actively cultivating positive qualities.
Precisely, and they found that these strengths cluster around 6 core virtues: wisdom, courage, humanity, justice, temperance, and transcendence.
6 core virtues. That sounds familiar. It seems like we've been circling around some of these same themes throughout our entire exploration of virtue, haven't we?
We have, and Peterson and Seligman's research suggests that these virtues aren't just arbitrary social constructs. They reflect something fundamental about human nature and what it means to live a good life.
So even though specific expressions of virtue might vary across cultures and time periods, there seems to be this core set of human strengths that are universally valued.
Exactly. And what's even more fascinating is that their research shows that these virtues are linked to greater happiness, well-being, and even physical health.
So being virtuous isn't just about being a good person in some abstract sense. It's actually good for you. That's like a recipe for a flourishing life.
That's a great way to put it. And that their work has had a significant impact, not just in the field of psychology, but in education, business, and even the military.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. It seems like virtue is having a bit of a renaissance these days.
It does indeed. And it's about time, wouldn't you say, after centuries of focusing on what's wrong with humanity, it's refreshing to see a shift towards studying and cultivating what's right with us.
I couldn't agree more. It's really amazing to think about how this whole idea of virtue, something that philosophers have been debating for centuries, is now being studied, scientifically.
Yeah, it really highlights the enduring relevance of these concepts. Virtue isn't just an abstract philosophical notion. It's something that's woven into the very fabric of our lives. It impacts our well-being, our relationships, and even our communities.
Right, exactly. It's not just about being a good person in some isolated sense. It's about how we connect to the world all around us.
And that's what makes this whole exploration so fascinating. Virtue isn't this static one-size-fits-all concept. It's dynamic, evolving, and deeply personal.
It makes you realize there's no single right way to be virtuous.
Right.
What resonates with one person might not resonate with another, and that's okay.
Yeah, it is. The beauty of virtue is that it invites us to embark on this lifelong journey of self-discovery and growth, figuring out what values and principles matter the most to us and how we can best embody them in our own unique ways.
So it's not about striving for some unattainable ideal of perfection. It's about, constantly learning, growing, and becoming the best versions of ourselves.
Precisely. And that process can look different for everyone. For some, it might involve focusing on developing specific character strengths like courage or compassion. For others, it might be about finding ways to contribute to their community or to live in greater alignment with their values.
This deep dive has really expanded my understanding of virtue. It's gone from something that felt a bit abstract and philosophical to something that feels very real and relevant to my own life.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. And as we wrap up our exploration, I'd love to hear what stands out to you as the most significant takeaway.
That's a good question. I think for me, it's this realization that virtue isn't just about following rules or adhering to some external code of conduct. It's about cultivating those inner qualities that allow us to live with purpose, integrity, and connection.
That's a beautiful insight. It's about aligning our actions with our deepest values and striving to make a positive impact on the world around us.
Exactly. Yeah. And I also appreciate the emphasis on the interconnectedness of virtue. It's not just about individual self-improvement. It's about recognizing that our actions have these ripple effects on others and on society as a whole.
That's such a crucial point. Virtue isn't something we practice in isolation. It's something we embody in our relationships, our communities, and our interactions with the world.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, from ancient Egypt to modern psychology. It's been an incredible journey.
It really has. And as we conclude this deep dive, we'll leave you with this final thought.
Ooh, I love a good thought-provoking question to ponder.
With all the diverse perspectives that we've explored today, which virtues resonate most deeply with you and why?
That's a great question for our listeners to reflect on. What qualities do you admire in others? What strengths do you want to cultivate in your own life? And how can you use your unique talents and passions to make a positive difference in the world?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the concept of virtue. We hope you found it as enlightening and inspiring as we did.
Until next time, keep seeking knowledge, keep diving deep, and keep striving to be the best version of yourself.